Okay, well, we've heard from you, Scott. Now, you tell us a little about yourself.
Very well. Hello, everyone. My name is Fenris, and I am, or was a World of Warcraft player. I started my journey in Azeroth in the fall of 2007, so around the middle of the Burning Crusade. It was a few months after my son was born. Looking at him now, a teenager who just celebrated his 14th birthday, it's a manifestation of my long history with this particular game. How did I last this long through all the ups and downs of expansions and patches and systems and bugs? Well, honestly, WoW just hit the right buttons for what I like best about gaming. I gravitate to the RPG genre and a fantasy world setting. WoW provided a detailed world to explore, challenging PvE content in the form of raiding, and those sweet, sweet dopamine hits. I played some other games throughout those years, but World of Warcraft was always my mainstay. And I will say this about the game. The art department is always impressed, creating new and wondrous environments to play in, whether it be cities, zones, raids, or dungeons. Additionally, when I went to pick some WoW music to play sparsely throughout this video, I realized how many outstanding tracks were orchestrated throughout the years that even today evoke a specific time and place. When I went back to play WoW Classic, the background music when first questing just sets the mood and takes you right back to your first days adventuring in Azeroth. So shout out to the art and music departments at Blizzard. Due to my history with and affection for the game, I assume that in the future, once I get my initial series out of the way, and yes, part 3 is being edited, slowly, I would make some videos analyzing certain aspects of WoW. In light of recent events, however, I wanted to share my story concerning World of Warcraft, especially as it has come to a close for a variety of reasons. I'm going to divide this video up into 3 topics of conversation: story, gameplay, and the company. I'm going to preface this section by stating that while I learned a lot about the history and lore of World of Warcraft as I played the game for well over a decade, I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be one. I haven't read any of the books that were published by Blizzard over the years. Though, from the sounds of it, I'm glad I never wasted my time embroiling myself in lore that just gets retconned every time you turn your head in order to lazily serve up a new villain or allow a writer to twist things the way they want. I feel I represent the typical player, where my knowledge is garnered from the game itself through quest texts and cutscenes, and not any external or third-party sources. And this should be enough. Ideally, one should understand the story and the characters involved in the world by just playing the game. A big tenet of the RPG genre is that story and characters are important. The whole point in this type of game is that players are assuming the role of a character in a fictional setting. The player can act out this role however they wish within the narrative. Typically, the player is dropped into an environment and the main story slowly unfolds over the course of the game, as well as the background lore of the world. Additionally, the player interacts with many different characters and may even group up with them, and some experience development throughout the game. In regards to WoW, when I started in what was still vanilla zones, you are an adventurer traveling around helping people with various problems. As you level and get stronger, you learn more about larger threats to the world of Azeroth. The Legion of Undead Scourge continue to spread corruption, tainting the ancient lands of Lordaeron. The Karaji, a merciless insectoid race, have recently become empowered by their reawakened Old God Master and begun making incursions past the magical barrier that has held them for 1,000 years. Deep in the heart of a mountain fortress, an ancient primal Fire Lord has been summoned and now commands the enslaved dwarven inhabitants to create armies out of stone. Sounds pretty cool, right? It was a fascinating open world for players to explore and engage in. Throughout later expansions, the main story would be more focused, with perhaps some mini-plots along the way. This was only natural, as each new expansion would involve a specific region as well as confronting a main villain. Before we delve into the writing issues plaguing WoW as of late, let's briefly talk about a writing tool. It can be called by different names, but I prefer Setup and Payoff. What is it? Well, Robert McKee describes it pretty well. He says, to set up means to layer in knowledge, to pay off means to close the gap by delivering that knowledge to the audience. When the gap between expectation and result propels the audience back through the story seeking answers, it can only find them if the writer has planted these insights in the work. A setup is essentially foreshadowing at something that will come later in the story. These hints or clues that are planted throughout the storyline may be very obvious or extremely subtle depending on the particular needs of the story at hand. But these are the points the audience will come back to and look at differently in hindsight once the payoff happens. Setups should make sense in the context of their appearance, be doled out at a steady pace, and make sense in hindsight after the payoff has occurred. A payoff is a reveal or twist that occurs in the story. It's the realization of what has been set up. They can come in many forms. A payoff may be a discovery or epiphany, or a twist or revelation. Sometimes it's just a punchline for a funny scene. Why use setups and payoffs at all? There can be a few different reasons for this. The author may need to set up some credibility for a future event, such as laying the groundwork that will be part of a major scene later on, so it doesn't seem to come out of nowhere. It may also be used to help build a character arc or increase tension for the audience. Or it may serve to lead the audience astray so they experience a twist later during the reveal or payoff. So why did we go through all that, other than I like to tie my videos to writing? Well, because WoW has lately been telling stories with a severe disconnect in the setup-payoff model. It's pretty equal opportunity. We have examples of setups with no payoff, as well as payoffs with scarce or illogical setups. The expansion before the current one, Battle for Azeroth, had a story that could be described as disjointed at best. Before it was released, it was teased as a continuation of the Horde and Alliance faction war as both sides strove to control resources of the land, especially the newly discovered Azerite. This in and of itself was initially met with some skepticism and surprise, as the two factions had combined forces many times now to defeat evils that threatened their world. In fact, they had just driven back the Burning Legion for the final time, rescued the Titans, and left Sargeras to the whims of the Pantheon as well as Illidan. So to now just turn back on each other and fight over resources on a planet they had just a moment ago saved seemed strange. Especially so since throughout WoW's history, players have encountered neutral groups that supersede the Horde and Alliance as they work together for a common purpose, such as the Cenarian Circle, which is comprised of druids from both factions, or the Argent Dawn, an organization that stood against threats to Azeroth. Indeed, Legion had also featured class order halls, where players were divided based on their class for a tailored storyline rather than by faction. But okay. However, for an expansion focused on war, there ended up being very little of it. It was mostly relegated to ancillary systems such as the command table and a few warfront scenarios. At the end of the expansion, if you had asked the player base the final outcome of this fourth war, most wouldn't have had a clue as to who won or lost and what was gained or given up, as it wasn't front and center for the entirety of the expansion. The patches for BFA broke down like this. In the initial launch, each faction explored new islands and sought the sea power provided by the reigning kingdoms there. For the raid, players assaulted a Titan research facility, which only the Horde got to understand the background behind. The first major patch was Tides of Vengeance. 2 new raids were featured, one where the Alliance besieges the capital of the Horde's new ally, Dazar Alor, and the other where players battle a long-submerged evil in Colteris with ties to an old god. The second major patch was Rise of Ashara. At this point, the faction wars seemed to already be over, as both sides were uniting to battle foes that had threatened their existence, just like they do most of the time. These enemies were mechanomes, which wanted to purge all flesh in favor of technology, and an ancient and powerful elven queen who made a pact with an old god 10,000 years ago that transformed her and her people into the Naga, who wanted to rule all of Azeroth. Finally, the last patch of the expansion, Visions of N'Zoth, saw that old god freed from his Titan prison and looking to subjugate the planet. Again, at this point, the faction battle was definitely set aside to focus on yet another different threat to the land. As you can see, the story moved away from a faction war fairly quickly. There was little to no setup to suddenly have Queen Ashara and N'Zoth appear and become the new enemies to face. Many people were upset that both of these large lore villains, who had been speculated about for years and had been patiently waiting on the sidelines for their turn in the spotlight, were dealt with in a single patch each. It seemed like the writers were just pulling major lore characters out of their hat to surprise the players and throw a spotlight on a big bad villain for the expansion. Payoffs, but without adequate setups. These 2 lore figures have been hinted at, whispered about, and theorized by lore nerds for years, but there was no real reason why they both suddenly made an appearance in Battle for Azeroth. Again, it seemed more like the writing team was pulling rabbits out of a hat to create tension rather than making a coherent story that built upon itself. and the result was evident. Players are not really engaged with the story that is just one surprise gotcha after another to try and artificially raise the stakes. War, Titans, Queen Ashara, Old Gods, and worst of all, Sylvanas Windrunner. Yes, I'm going to have to talk about Sylvanas. It would be hard not to, as she's been the primary focus of the writers for many expansions now. In fact, she's the only character thus far to be the narrator and star of 2 expansion trailers, and back-to-back no less. And that doesn't even count the focus on her and other cinematics for the last 3 expansions. In regards to the writing and emphasis on Sylvanas, I give you the lead narrative designer for World of Warcraft, Steve Denuser. How does this guy feel about Sylvanas? Let's see if we can find out. Oh. Gee, wonder why the Dark Lady has taken center stage for so long. And then there's her right-hand man, Nathanos Blightcaller. Why did this undead guy, who is pretty good with the bow, suddenly rise to prominence in the story? Why does he look so differently now from his initial appearance in Vanilla WoW? I guess since it isn't good enough to just sleep with the body pillow of Sylvanas, Denuser uses Nathanos as his self-insert. Apparently in some novel he gets Mr. Blightcaller a new, handsome body. And suddenly in BFA, Nathanos is leading the efforts for the Horde and directing the player around. He also acts like what an edgy 13-year-old would think is cool, but just teeters between annoying and laughable. Nathanos is constantly irritated by the player and throws out insults to everyone like he's too good for us all. That is, except for one special person, Sylvanas, his Dark Lady. When he addresses her, his usual snarky tone changes to obedient lapdog instantly. Yes, she is so great, so perfect, that she's the only one that Nathanos respects. And therefore, you too should respect her and find her amazing as well. I hope the writers don't actually think anyone finds Nathanos cool, because to everyone else he's a joke. Lately, Sylvanas is implied to be just too smart for everyone as she pursues her secret agenda. She has also gained lots of new, unknown powers so she can easily win any battle. No matter what Sylvanas does, we are told she is never wrong. There's a reason for her actions. However, these motivations are never presented to the audience, either through dialogue or actions. Therefore, all these horrible things she does, like preemptive genocide, don't match that narrative. The writers keep her thoughts, feelings, and rationales hidden from us, only reassuring players over and over that we'll see eventually, and to just wait. But too many years of anticipation while Sylvanas disappears for long periods, only to pop up in every cinematic and commit terrible acts with newfound, unexplained powers, doesn't breed enthusiasm. Quite the opposite, actually. Most players are just tired of her being the sole center of attention, tired of being kept in the dark speculating what grand scheme she is enacting. You know, I wonder if all this mystery is really due to the writers not having much of a plan. Since there isn't much actual setup going on for the audience, this promised big payoff won't have as much weight as the writers think it will. WoW decided to expand their lore and delve into the metaphysical even more, sending players this time into the Shadowlands, or the realm of death where deceased souls go. However, this already presents some challenges. In the course of the story, players in the Carrion faction experience their duty, angel-like beings who are responsible for ferrying mortal souls into the afterlife. The sequence is centered around a hapless farmer whose town is overrun by the Scourge, or undead, and he perishes while trying to protect his family and fellow villagers. Surely an untimely and sorrowful death, yet he's immediately taken to the Shadowlands. However, in past expansions of WoW, there are many ghosts and spirits that inhabit the world of Azeroth. Players sometimes interact with them to perform tasks and complete quests to give them peace. How are they still around if they're ferried to the Shadowlands without a choice or say in the matter? I also think it's a very naive and simplistic view of the afterlife, though for gameplay purposes I suppose it would have to be. It reminds me of movies or TV shows where heaven is just people exactly when they died, suspended in that age and clothing for all eternity, now mingling amongst the clouds. Piercing this veil and seeing what holds in store for you after decades of strife on Azeroth or another world just doesn't seem that enticing. Consider a paladin who fought against a scourge in their adulthood. As a great warrior, they're sent to Maldraxxus after they perish. So now for eternity, they don't get to see a sunny sky or clouds, but instead are immersed in a land basically made up of the enemy they fought? Surrounded by pestilent pools and fumes with no vegetation, having only wraiths and skeletons and sewn together constructs as companionship? It doesn't really sound that great. Also, the writers have made this place seem very small. Even though this is the afterlife for all inhabited worlds in the WoW universe, or is that the multiverse if we count WoD, the vast majority of deceased souls we encounter are from our very own Azeroth. I guess the other planets didn't amount to much. But who are we kidding? This is really a vehicle to trot out old characters from lore and reuse them in the story. The reason we players are here? Sylvanas, of course, who drives the story by just having the script handed to her. I mean, because she knows what her master plan is, and we are idiots following and trying to catch up. Now all these powers seem to come from a mysterious entity known as the Jailer, who is a major figure in the Shadowlands. By the way, why is he even called the Jailer? Jailer means he's the person in charge of a jail, and the prisoners locked up in it. But in the opening cinematics of the Shadowlands expansion, he is shown to be the one who is chained up. Isn't he the jailed, not the jailer of others? And once players started questing through the new zones of the Shadowlands, we discover that his name is actually Zoval, and he is an eternal one, part of the pantheon of death along with the other leaders of the various zones we visit during the main storyline. However, due to an unknown reason, he was banished long ago to the Maw and imprisoned there by his brethren. There's also the question of when all this happened. Again, in a preview cinematic, we see the Jailer still jailed and chained with Sylvanas. Another more high-res one before Shadowlands came out also shows Zoval chained and imprisoned. So when exactly did he break free, build his fortress, amass an army, imprison the Primus and make a deal with Kel'Thuzad, corrupt Davos and help create the Mawsworn, bargain with the Nathrius and set in motion the plan to gain that anima, and conspire with the Dreadlords? Did he accomplish all that in a week? Was he really freed ages ago? One possible explanation is a throwaway line from Jaina during the player's introduction sequence to the Shadowlands. Even though you've leapt in just behind her, she talks about being captured and tortured and escaping multiple times. So I guess time works differently in the Shadowlands, which is a way to just lampshade any critical analysis of events. Once again, players are kept in dark as to what the Jailer's ultimate goals are, what Sylvanas is up to, aside from a few cutscenes with Anduin, and why we're even really there other than to follow Sylvanas. 9.1 promised some answers, and a possible resolution as the end boss of the new raid was none other than Sylvanas Windrunner. And if anyone actually thought that since Sylvanas was finally a raid boss in the Sanctum of Domination meant she would really and truly die, they must have been delusional. No way Danuzer could let go of his waifu. When the raid dropped and players reached the end, they saw a cutscene that, well, did not turn out as epic as it was hyped up to be. Gee, did you really think someone with the moniker the Jailer, who likes to insert the word domination in the things he names, whose magic involves putting literal chains on people, would turn out to be a bad guy who wants to dominate and control everyone and bend them all to his will? How utterly shocking! What a super surprising twist! Why that never occurred to her before this diminishes Sylvanas as a character, which is directly a fault of the people writing her. Instead of being a big reveal, the most obvious thing happened and only Sylvanas was surprised about it, which does not make her look smart. Now, every single choice she made and the actions she was doing off-screen that players were speculating about, well, for anyone who was left caring at this point, was not Sylvanas working towards some grand ultimate goal that superseded any current petty conflicts. Instead, she was just a lackey of Zoval, doing whatever he commanded in order to secure whatever he promised her. It was already ridiculous that she didn't seem to realize all this time that she was serving the Jailer by helping him with this plan, and only now is triggered by that word and says, "I will not serve. I mean, I did say I'd served the Horde before, and now I've been willingly serving you for years and years, but no, now at this moment, no more serving for you, good sir." It just rings hollow and is incongruous with her prior actions. The ironic thing is the writers probably thought it would be some epic line and moment, but just like Grommash proclaiming Draenor free at the end of Warlords, it rings hollow and doesn't really make much sense in the context of what has actually happened. And her solution is utterly ridiculous. One arrow of hers will surely put down this guy with Titan-like powers that just regained a lot of it. But of course, since she is too important, he doesn't squash her like he should. The Jailer commits the obvious mustache-twirling villain mistake of underestimating his foe. So instead he gives Sylvanas her soul fragment that was ripped from her when she fell to Frostmourne. Gee, her punishment ends up being a win as she's made whole again. Sure, she will probably have to come to terms with what she did while split, but it is now a convenient excuse for a redemption arc that plays like a soap opera tactic. Well, all that bad stuff was done when I was my own evil twin. And I'm sure all of Azeroth will eventually welcome her back with open arms, atrocities or not, so that Denuzer's queen can play a major role in events going forward. These are payoffs that do not land with the audience because there was no proper setup. The sad part is that Sylvanas started off as a fairly interesting character. She, along with her two sisters, Verisa and Ilaria, was a high elf who rose to become Ranger General of the Farstriders. She heroically fought against the advance of Arthas and his Scourge when they marched on Silvermoon seeking the Sunwell. And tragically, she fell to his blade, Frostmourne. Since she had caused him so much grief in battle, the Lich King did not give her a quick death, but instead ripped out her soul and transformed her into a banshee to do his bidding. Later, when his control was weakened, she was able to break free and reclaim her body. She leads a group of renegade former mindless Scourge and creates the Forsaken, vowing to battle the Scourge. It's a tragic story where she fights valiantly for her people, is then horribly tortured and now has to learn to live a new life as an outcast, an undead creature trapped between the realms of life and death. There's actually some interesting quests in the Ghostlands which give a little of the background of Sylvanas Windrunner, as well as retrieving a necklace she was once given by her sister Ilaria. It's a shame that she's now been twisted to this evil one-dimensional character that can't be touched. I feel like there's a writing term for this. You know, someone who is a clear favorite of the writer, so they keep gaining mysterious new powers. Other characters are diminished, so they constantly win. They're more important and special than anyone else. Even their losses actually have no negative effects, but typically gain them something. They have no flaws. Wish I could remember what that was. I do remember it's akin to fanfiction levels of amateurish writing. On the other end of the spectrum, we have this whole Tyrande the Night Warrior story, which seemed like a B-plot anyways that eventually led nowhere. I honestly don't know what the point was, since nothing ever got accomplished by her taking on this mantle. The players have been told that the Night Warrior ritual is powerful, so much so that even just witnessing it could put you in danger. By doing this, Tyrande is supposedly becoming the incarnation of Elun's wrath. Elun, one of the true deities in the Warcraft universe. While little thus far is known about her, she's intimated to be very powerful, worshipped not only by the Night Elves on Azeroth, but other races on other planets as well. And now this raw power is imbibed into Tyrande, who is already pretty powerful on her own. And the outcome? She killed a single Valkyr? And eventually she rightfully kills Nathanos, which maybe he wanted at that point so he could rejoin Sylvanas in the afterlife. That's pretty much it, while everyone else has no sympathy for her or the Night Elf's plight and just talk about how she went too far and needs to relinquish the Night Warrior power. Tyrande gets no resolution or closure for the burning of Teldrassil, no revenge on anyone, has no one even on her side, and now has let go of this power. Apparently, previously the Night Warrior was able to carve out a huge empire for the Night Elves, but is powerless against the plot armor of a couple of archers. Let's look at this more in detail. Tyrande and Malfurion Stormrage confront Nathanos and a couple of Valkyr. Normally, one of them should be more than enough for all three, but now the both of them, one imbued with extra power, can't do anything against an undead guy with a bow. The writers seem to course correct this by later having her easily defeat Nathanos in a pre-patch event, but again, it seemed almost like a victory for him as he wanted to follow his Dark Lady into the Shadowlands. So it almost hinted that he allowed her to kill him. And then Tyrande finally gets to confront Sylvanas in a short cutscene in the recent campaign. What's she been doing in the meantime? Oh, just hanging out in the maw, unable to even rescue some Night Elf souls from torture without the help of the player. But now she finally has the chance to exact revenge on the person responsible for her misery and grief. Instead, two people who have amassed a lot of magical power just jump and slash at each other like a bad anime fight. And as another out, Tyrande now has to say she gives up her life just to kill one person? Seems like a convenient out to explain why Elun's Night Warrior power leaves her just as she's about to kill Sylvanas. Can't have the future raid boss extinguished too quickly. Of course, why is Tyrande trying to choke an undead person? They don't breathe. And even though Sylvanas can become incorporeal when she chooses, she doesn't at that point, only a few seconds later when Isara intervenes. In this case, there was a lot of setup, but zero payoff as this incredible Night Warrior power is used to accomplish nothing. If all this wasn't enough, a new cinematic has just been released with the first ever dialogue from Elune, the moon goddess herself, speaking through her Night Warrior champion, Tyrande. And what wisdom does she impart as she speaks to players for the first time? People who have wondered about this mysterious entity for almost 2 decades. Oh, that she wasn't aware of the inert arbiter and all souls pouring into the maw, so she sat back and allowed the destruction of Teldrassil and the night elf people she beloved because she thought their souls could go to Ardenweald, where her sister the Winter Queen could use up all their anima to feed her dying realm. Wow, what a great deity. She sees an entire race that worships her as nothing more than logs for the furnace. She's basically no better than the jailer who would forego these mortal souls' afterlife to just provide fuel for their plans. Another example of how the writers aren't treating the characters as people who live in a world is Kel'Thuzad. Sylvanas Windrunner would not want anything to do with him and question why the man she's working for is employing this lich. But there's no acknowledgement of this from the Banshee Queen, no denouement at all. I guess there wasn't time in the story to acknowledge these two figures with a long history being brought together again. And that is where suspension of disbelief is broken, as the world doesn't feel real when there should be some sort of exchange between them. Or at the very least, it should cause doubt in Sylvanas as to who she is working for and their true purposes. But I guess not. It appears to me through these examples and more that the writing team for World of Warcraft are using a common template that is pervasive in media recently, going for gotcha moments and shock value, which they view as compelling storytelling. Instead, they're destroying existing lore and character development and foregoing logic for a surprise that goes over like a lead balloon. And continuing to do this will soon leave you with nothing. They haven't really expanded on any new characters they've created themselves, and you can only keep trading on your predecessor's creations so long before they're damaged beyond repair. WoW has always had issues, like the MCU, of clearly defining power levels when they keep escalating out of control, but they also have an issue of being too afraid to actually kill off major lore characters. And they haven't really developed new ones that could take up the mantle and create new storylines. The problem with constantly having all actions and motivations hidden and off screen for years is that eventually the song and dance gets old. When none of the players understand the motivations, goals, emotional state, and thoughts of the main characters, then it's hard to understand the stakes. And if there's no stakes, there's no tension, no suspense. There's no real payoff without a proper setup first. And that's what WoW's writing has been lacking for a while, supposed payoffs that fall flat because there was no corresponding setup. Only very recently had the writers introduced the MacGuffin of these sigils from each Covenant leader. What do these sigils represent and how are they tied to each leader? Who knows? Why does Zovell want these sigils? What power do they grant? How do they help him? I don't know, something bad? So the stakes aren't clearly defined, but there is a MacGuffin to chase to keep the story lumbering forward. But now the writers have an issue. They need to have the jailer actually obtain all the sigils so he can move on to the next step. The stakes need to be raised to, hopefully, build tension in the story. If we safeguard them and he doesn't collect them all, the story's now over as he just stays in the maw and doesn't get whatever power he wanted from them, and we don't see what his ultimate plan was. So he needs to somehow get them all so we can possibly see what the implications are, reach a low point, build tension, and have the villain get powerful so that when we heroes eventually take him down, it's more satisfying. How do we get a guy confined to the maw able to obtain these relics from powerful beings that should guard them closely? Well, you can try and do it cleverly, or do it lazily and just have everyone act illogically and stupidly so he gets them, and we can plot on to the next chapter in the story. I'll let you decide which direction the WoW writers took. When the jailer takes a sigil from the Arbiter and incorporates it into the gaping hole in his chest and transforms, the audience still doesn't know what that means. Where is he going and what does he intend to do? I mean, other than the mustache twirling, "Haha, I will retake all the worlds and bend them to my will." There's no tension as the players don't know the stakes. Many players have expressed that they don't know where the jailer is headed, what his plans are, or what the significance of that ending cinematic was. And seeing that we're about halfway through this expansion, not knowing any of that means that it's a failure on the writer's part, plain and simple. They miss out on creating a meaningful setup in order to focus solely on the spectacle of the payoff. This is the result of too much rule of cool focus and thinking that shock value is good storytelling. Thus, there's little to no investment from the players. And so personally, I've disengaged from the whole story of WoW. And if I'm not interested in the story of an RPG, then it better have damn good gameplay to keep me invested. As expansions have come and gone, more and more changes have been implemented by the developers of WoW that restrict more of the player's freedom. It has become increasingly apparent that they now feel that all players should only experience and play WoW one certain way, and any other avenue should be blocked, or at the very least made painful to utilize. I originally had written a lot more expanding in detail on various systems that have been implemented, but I thought for clarity's sake I'll just focus on some key topics to highlight the issues. Legion was the beginning of Blizzard's use of borrowed power systems as the primary source of gameplay. Before Legion, player performance depended on their talent choices, gearing, and skill with that particular class. But this expansion was the beginning of using external sources rather than internal to the specific character or the player driving them as a way to enhance performance. And it's not even that imaginative. A lot of powers cross over from expansion to expansion. So now I get a key ability in Legion through my artifact weapon that changes the way my spec is played and get used to that rotation. However, once BFA drops and I start to level again, I immediately lose that ability and my player feels weaker and clunkier. Once I grind through and reach max level again, I then obtain a piece of Azerite armor with that ability, and so I incorporate it back into my rotation. It's not really that satisfying to jump through the same hoops over and over again. On the creative front, most of these additional powers end up being very passive or very simplistic. A borrowed power will just increase the damage of a spell, or give the player, say, 5% crit, or it gives a chance to proc an increase in damage or a secondary stat. It's typically not something that really alters a player's standard rotation or gives them something to react to or focuses them on gearing a specific way. It's just something going on in the background that a player hoped they'd have lucky procs with. For instance, if you had bad RNG one pull and your power didn't proc as much as pull number 2, you could have vastly different results that you as the player have no control over. You can play both fights the exact same way and have different results. Very different results. Or, say the power procs the same number of times during 2 pulls on a boss, but in one case it happens when you need to move and can't DPS, and the other time it hits when you're blowing cooldowns and dumping on the boss. Again, the player has no control over this, their skill level doesn't affect the numbers. To be fair, there was some choices for these systems. Depending on whether you were raiding, where a player would focus on single target DPS typically, or running Mythic Plus dungeons where a player might want to focus more on burst AoE DPS. It could cause you to change up some Azerite armor traits and essences along with talent choices. But in the end, the result is not much engagement. In Legion, players selected the best legendaries and left them in those slots. In BFA, players chose the best Azerite traits, set and forget. They targeted and obtained the best essences, locked them into the Heart of Azeroth neck, and moved on. They either wished for their best corruption to drop or targeted it when they could buy them. In Shadowlands, players overwhelmingly chose the best Covenant for their class and spec. They utilize the best Soulbind and drop in the best conduits that give them the best increase, and then forget about them. It doesn't have much lasting impact, and that's what Blizzard has fostered. Players know that by the last patch of an expansion they will have access to everything, finally defeating the RNG gods. Additionally, they know that these powers are temporary anyways, something only relevant in the current expansion and then discarded at the start of the next. Why should they be invested? This is highlighted in the Covenant choice for Shadowlands. Once a player chooses to align with one of 4 Covenants, they receive 2 new abilities. But these end up being a Covenant one that is mostly hardly used, and a class one that is basically just another button to press on cooldown. And since you travel around to the other zones still for world quests, bosses, Mythic Plus dungeons, etc., there isn't that much tying you to your Covenant. While I played Shadowlands, I never heard another player refer to themselves as a Venthyr Paladin or a Kyrian Warrior, as Ian seems to think. It isn't much of a meaningful choice as Blizzard would have you believe, and by 10.0 it'll be discarded and forgotten, like all the other systems. In addition, the attention on new gimmicks and specifics of these new systems have shifted the focus away from core gameplay elements for classes. There's no need to retool class design when instead you can strip them of key abilities at the start of each expansion, then embed them in some new system for the players to reacquire. And there are other issues with borrowed powers, such as when a player is faced with a multitude of choices, it is good to have balance between them. Otherwise, why not always choose the strongest option and leave it at that? If there's always one clear correct choice, then there is little to no engagement with the system in the first place. Just slot it in and never think about it again. Each time Blizzard describes a new system, their intent is to create choice for players, where it isn't about which one is stronger, but for instance, one gives you a strong AoE stun which might be useful in certain situations, whereas the other grants you a temporary shield against damage. Unfortunately, in execution, this is rarely the case. This is the situation Blizzard wants to avoid, but unfortunately for them, it is the common way the majority of players engage with their systems. Every, and I mean every borrowed power system Blizzard has introduced has had massive variance between the options. It's baffling why they can't or don't catch this before it's released. These are always pointed out in alpha and beta, and many third-party simulators have the breakdown quickly after launch. And I want to clarify here first before we dive into examples. A lot of critics state that these variances are only 1 to 2%, and only Metaslaves should even care about them. They say to stop deluding yourself that you're a top 50 world raider and just choose whatever is most fun and stop trying to min-max. Of course, they never offer any actual proof of this minuscule variance, so take that as you will. As a player, I can tell you that it has been tested and verified that the difference between the best and worst choices were fairly significant. And it isn't just about numbers. Some of these borrowed power systems could change your character's gameplay and improve it in a way to make it more viable, which isn't quantifiable. In Legion, legendaries for every class and spec were widely different. There were usually 1 or 2 that were absolutely necessary, since not only did they increase your throughput, but they supplemented your toolkit in a meaningful way. 2 players with the same class and spec, wearing comparable eye-level gear, could perform very differently if one had the quote-unquote good legendary versus the other. Another factor to Legion legendaries, that I will touch upon in another section, but suffice to say it was very frustrating for players with bad luck. Even throughout Legion, Blizzard had to make significant adjustments to the legendaries, such as decreasing the effect of Greenskin's waterlogged wrist cuffs by 200%, or Ice Time going from 1200% of spell power down to 150%. These are not minor changes, these are orders of magnitude. In the Battle for Azeroth expansion, Azerite powers contained on the armor pieces were also widely different in their usefulness. There were the 1 or 2 you absolutely needed for your class or spec to perform, some were okay, and others you avoided. And the problem is that most of these powers were passive. All they did was increase something, usually via a proc. In fact, if you managed your UI a lot, especially with player buffs, you ended up filtering out these Azerite procs as they just happened all the time and cluttered up the screen. They weren't important to track because they had no impact on your standard gameplay or rotation. Similarly, in 8.3, the last major patch of BFA, Blizzard added in essences to the Heart of Azeroth neck to expand on that system. And again, some essences were crucial for a given class or spec, while others had little to no impact on your gameplay. So naturally, most players targeted the ones they needed for the content they were interested in, got them, slotted them into their neck, and forgot about them. Also in 8.3, Blizzard introduced the corruption system, based off the old god N'Zoth spreading his corruption over Azeroth. Some of these corruptions were widely insane in their power increase, so much so that they received nerfs up to 50%. Yes, these were so unbalanced that Blizzard would have to halve their power, and even then there were a couple that were highly sought after, while others took a back seat. It's also annoying the players who originally sought these powerful corruptions, then had to completely switch their gearing when they got nerfed. But hey, guess that extends your playtime to regrind things. Looking at their prior track record of zero success with balancing systems, I don't know why anyone would give Blizzard the benefit of the doubt that these covenants would be balanced. Especially when looking at 36 specs across 13 classes, especially when considering single target, AoE, and PvP gameplay. And predictably, this was the case. The vast majority of players chose their Covenant based on whichever one was deemed most optimal. Most DPS ended up as Night Fae, whether they liked the aesthetic or not, because it gave the best DPS increase. Incidentally, it also offered the best movement spell out of the Covenant abilities, which is always a useful power to have when in dungeons, raids, or PvP. Additionally, the soulbinds were unbalanced as well. Some were great for all scenarios, while others are to be avoided as they don't offer much advantage at all. Conduits follow the same pattern. Some are mandatory for a spec in any content, others are worthless. There's only the thin appearance of meaningful choice. In the newest patch, 9.1, Blizzard introduced Domination Gear and Domination Sockets. And to no one's surprise, one of the three types far outclassed the others. Blizzard's solution? They've now already nerfed the effects into the ground, so they offer little incentive to obtain them at all. How much time was spent on another new system to throw in the mix for a patch that is already almost irrelevant? Have you noticed a pattern yet? Blizzard announces something out of the blue or puts it on the PTR to test since, why pay for a QA department when players will do it for free? Players easily see the potential pitfalls and drawbacks and even suggest workarounds. These are ignored as the WoW team's decisions are all above question. Blizzard implements a half-baked idea and it is broken and unbalanced. Players complain about something that was identified early on but not changed for some reason and has now gone live, but Blizzard scoffs at naysayers or ignores any or all criticism or feedback. Finally, the issue is later silently fixed in a hotfix, or in a later patch the decision to balance comes down to nerfing everything into the ground so it doesn't really matter. Either that, or in some cases, they go in with a mallet where a scalpel is needed and swing the pendulum far in the other direction, causing more angst for the players who just want to play their game. There's always going to be some RNG involved in WoW. In the early days, this was limited to item drops, critical strikes, and some procs. Most abilities and talents were controlled by the player, so they decided when to use it and when it'd be on cooldown. Recently, RNG has taken on a whole new meaning. So many systems are tied to it. Before the Mists of Pandaria, when you received a piece of gear or dropped in the highest tier of rating, that was it. You knew you had the best choice for that slot and you could focus on the others. So how can you get a raider to still look for more when they receive a mythic drop? Why, introduce Warforging, Titanforging, Thunderforging into the game. Now when a piece of gear drops at his best in slot, you can instead be disappointed instead of overjoyed because it didn't get some extra eye levels, a socket, or tertiary stats. And now you want to keep raiding so you can get all of your slots decked out in these random upgraded gear. Hooray, now we'll never be done each patch with our gearing. A lot of people remember Legion with fondness, and there were a lot of good things about that expansion. But Pepperidge Farms remembers the beginning of Legion, where powerful legendaries were only acquired randomly as a drop by doing content. Players never knew when or where they would loot a legendary item for themselves, which made a great incentive to log in and do all your daily tasks, hoping for a lucky drop. Some people could get one quickly, while others were disappointed over and over. Blizzard assured players that a bad luck protection algorithm was in place, so eventually players would receive their legendaries if they were diligent. Someone worked out what this algorithm might be and shared it with the community. It seemed like a player's first 2 legendaries were fairly easy to obtain, and then the length of time between acquisitions would stretch out. This would cause some hardcore players to actually re-roll their class if the first 2 legendaries they received on a character were not very good. Let me reiterate this, players would rather re-level a class from 1 and re-gear it in the hopes of getting powerful legendaries rather than keep playing on one that was maxed but had received mediocre legendary items. That's how insane this power system was and how unbalanced the legendaries were. It was frustrating for players to feel so uncompetitive due to sheer blind luck, nothing they could control. RNG has been a cornerstone of WoW in recent expansions. Warforging, Titanforging, whatever you want to call it. Tertiary stats or sockets randomly appearing on gear drops. Weekly chests with random loot drops. Random conduit drops to chase. There seems to be no other reason for this other than to artificially extend playtime. Blizzard seems to be afraid now of players getting their best or satisfactory gear and then just logging out until the next patch. But why? This didn't happen before in Vanilla, TBC, Wrath, etc. players still found their own goals and content to pursue, either alone or with friends. Is the WoW development team so afraid that their content is stale that once someone gets best in slot, they have no other reason to log in? There also seems to be almost a mandatory path you have to take once you reach max level. For people like me who like to play alts, you have the fun of leveling that alt through content and you have a variety of choices to do so. But once you reach the max level for the expansion, you're faced with a long list of chores that alt now has to do in order to kind of be viable in content. So at the end of the day, I'm just tired of running the same treadmill. Borrowed powers, a lot of which are just repackaged legendary abilities or talents that were trimmed before. Unable to strive toward a goal since I'm either halted by time gating or slave to RNG. An unbalanced new system where I just pick the best choices and never think about it again. Unless Blizzard does some tuning, in which case I now have to re-chase new things. Especially since in the end they will all be nerfed into the ground and then become worthless when the new expansion drops. It's a vicious cycle and seems to constantly work against how I want to play and enjoy the game. And with the story completely off the rails and not engaging me, and gameplay that is frustrating and working counter to my enjoyment, I ended up stepping away from retail WoW weeks ago, soon after 9.1 dropped. I figured I'd still dabble in TBC Classic and do a victory lap there before disengaging from WoW completely. As it was the expansion when I first started, it has a lot of nostalgia for me. Also, I could finish some accomplishments I never got to do the first time around. I never got to finish and obtain the Champion of the Naru title before it was gone. I jumped from a novice guild barely pugging T4 to an actual raiding guild clearing T6, so I missed out on T5 content when it was relevant. Though it was pretty cool going from an inexperienced raider to having Shadow Resist gear and Warlock tanking Illidan in Phase 4. I have a great guild on TBC Classic, shout out to At Midnight hanging in there as Alliance on Fairbanks, and it would have been a fun way to go out. Wrath Classic wouldn't interest me as much because I had played it out when it was current. But then... I have observed over time that the love-hate relationship Blizzard has with its customers, particularly World of Warcraft customers, has tipped much more toward hate in recent years. I've never seen a company that has such an antagonistic view of their own customer base. It's like they despise the people who play their game and really want to actively drive them off so they can attain the correct audience. It makes one wonder, why stay with a company that seems to despise you as a paying customer and wants to waste your time? Is Blizzard just hoping to ride things through since there is a healthy population of addicts who won't quit the game no matter how they're treated? It's indicative of a culture where the entire team is safely inside a bubble and they ignore all feedback from players since they know better. And they seem to resent any comments that run contrary to what they think is the best way to play the game. And so you have these really tone-deaf statements that constantly spew out from the company, which sets the players against the development team. It's unfortunate to create this scenario, since really they should view themselves as partners on the same side of the table with a common goal, creating a fun and immersive game to enjoy. During BlizzCon 2013, then production director of World of Warcraft and later president of Blizzard, J. Allen Brack, answered a question from an audience member about the possibility of having servers with older versions of the game to play. There are already many private servers in existence that emulated Blizzard's code to create environments that were static to one expansion, such as Vanilla or Wrath of the Lich King. These were obviously illegal and could be shut down with a court order from the company if discovered, but some players, like the one who posed this question, wondered if Blizzard could perform this themselves. They wanted a sanctioned server that would allow them to revisit the WoW of the past with friends. You can see his reaction and answer here.
Have you ever thought about adding servers for previous expansions as they were then?
No. And by the way, you don't want to do that either. You think you do, but you don't.
But his tune changed in 2017 when WoW Classic was announced, which was a massive success when it would launch and brought back many old-time players who wanted to experience WoW in its initial incarnation. During BlizzCon 2018, there was a lot of excitement on the Diablo stage. Longtime fans were hungrily awaiting a sequel to 2012's Diablo 3. Instead, they were disappointed to find out that Blizzard was there to introduce a new mobile game for the franchise, Diablo Immortal. The developers on stage were surprised at the crowd's reaction, mostly a mix of either dead silence or booing. Blizzard had partnered with NetEase, a Chinese company, to put forth a version of Diablo on mobile platforms, leading many to believe this was targeted specifically to the Asia-Pacific region, which easily leads the mobile gaming segment in market share. Historically, up until this point, Blizzard games typically launched on PC first, or exclusively, and then ported to consoles later. Therefore, the company should have known by now that their players were primarily hardcore PC gamers. Presenting what appeared to be a reskinned generic mobile game to these hardcore PC and console gamers that make up the fanbase was not exactly a wise decision. At the Q&A session, one person asked this.
Hey, just was wondering, is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
And here's Wyatt Cheng, a designer on Diablo, not reading the crowd at all and missing the point completely.
Is there any plans to make this playable on PC, or is this strictly mobile forever?
Are there any? The current plan is to be on mobile, both Android and iOS. We don't have any plans at the moment to do PC. Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Diablo Immortal is still in the works, but at this point its release has been delayed to the first half of 2022. Even 3 years later, though, the game is still mostly known for its controversial unveiling, and recent developer update videos are still heavily downvoted and memed. In October of 2019, a professional Hearthstone player known as Blitzchung donned a protest mask during an interview at a streaming event and said, "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times." The following day, Blizzard responded by announcing that Blitzchung had been banned from the current tournament, would forfeit any prize money, and would be banned from other Grandmaster tournaments for 1 year. Obviously, Chinese officials and companies condemned Blitzchung's message, but there were many others that supported it. Many angry Blizzard fans and other Hong Kong supporters protested Blizzard's response, and the hashtag Boycott Blizzard rose in prominence. Some Blizzard employees protested and held a walkout. Casters for an upcoming Hearthstone tournament dropped out, and companies dropped their sponsorships. The situation blew up in Blizzard's face as they were seen as kowtowing to the Chinese government in order to protect their own business interests there. Some criticized the weight and impact of Blitzchung's ban as an unfair treatment when compared to lesser penalties that Blizzard had placed on Overwatch League professional players for vulgar statements and gestures on camera. So a full 5 days after the incident, J. Allen Brack wrote that after reviewing the situation, Blizzard felt the penalties applied were not appropriate. They reinstated Blitzchung's winnings, reduced his ban from Grandmasters to 6 months, and reduced the casters' bans also to 6 months. Brack also apologized a month later at BlizzCon. In 2020, Warcraft 3 Reforged released, and what should have been an easy remaster of a beloved strategy game instead turned out to be a fiasco. Due to poor communication by Blizzard, are we seeing a trend here yet? And plans that changed over the course of development from its announcement at BlizzCon 2018, Reforged ended up not being the remaster many people expected. Cutscenes were not as dramatically improved as seen in the 2018 preview, lacking their cinematic flair and emotion. The newly remodeled 3D graphics on some maps actually made them harder to navigate. Blizzard even upset the die-hard players who still compete in the 2002 original by forcing that version to use Reforged's new client, which is strangely missing some key features. None of this was helped by a new end-user license agreement that stated Blizzard would have ownership over all user-created content. Reforged garnered mediocre critic reviews and was met with overwhelmingly negative player reviews when it launched. In response, the company offered refunds to any players who purchased the new game, and promised a series of patches to fix technical bugs and reinstate missing features. However, this still hasn't really happened, which has upset a lot of players. The bottom line is many players felt Blizzard lied to them when they sold them on a Warcraft 3 that doesn't exist. Anyone who plays WoW has probably heard of Asmongold. And think what you want of him, but he is passionate about the game and has amassed a lot of viewers on Twitch over the years. There's no doubt that at the very least he has created a lot of awareness about World of Warcraft during the years. Recently, Asmongold has started playing Final Fantasy XIV, and his streams are garnering massive views and support from the Final Fantasy community who are excited to have him finally try the game and give it more recognition. But one small Final Fantasy streamer doesn't want Asmongold in the game and urged others to report him constantly. Okay, streamers fighting on Twitter, who cares? But then a manager of Blizzard, Adam Holinsky, decided to chime in by replying and calling Asmongold an asshole. I mean, it just doesn't look good for Blizzard employees to be publicly calling their customers assholes, no matter what the circumstances, and certainly when there wasn't any prior interaction, as far as I know, between Asmongold and Holinsky. But this is where we're at with the company. There is certainly a feeling that Blizzard wants a completely different player base than the one that propelled them to popularity years ago and has kept them raking in profits quarter after quarter. Recently, Blizzard has made a minor change to the TBC Classic PTR client. It was done very secretly without any accompanying blue post or explanation. What was this change? To remove the use of the spit emote on other players. Looking closer at this provides yet another example of how Blizzard does things lately with no clear logic. I mean, first of all, we could get into a whole discussion of why this emote is even in the game. But I guess it's being removed so Blizzard games and their player base as an extension will appear less toxic. Well, why is this only being done in TBC Classic, not the retail or vanilla Classic clients? Perhaps it has something to do with the specific use of it in TBC Classic. Players who disapproved of people who bought the Dark Pass portal and who rode around on the mount bore the brunt of the spitting assault. However, this doesn't really accomplish anything at all. Players can still use the emote generally, but it'll just show them spitting on the floor. They can use a /me emote and write out that they are spitting on their target, which can easily be made into a macro. Other emotes, such as rude or fart or moon, aren't affected and could be substituted as the degrading gesture. Or even less direct ones such as facepalm, disappointed, snicker, snub, sigh, smell, Rolf, pick, guffaw, frown, cringe, chicken, to show their displeasure and single out these players on the bought mounts. Again, the point is that Blizzard reacts quickly but without much deliberation. When examined for even just a second, their solution doesn't make much sense and is very surface level for show rather than solving the root cause of the issue. So there's a lot of examples here in recent years of Blizzard being seemingly out of touch with their core player base and a feeling of resentment as their answers to player questions can be taken as condescending. Not only that, but the company has a pattern of reacting in a way that is not supported by their fans or perceived positively by the general public, and then having to come back and apologize or revise their statements. They have such a dissonance with their player base that they are genuinely confused when their answers or announcements aren't met with fanfare. Why can't they get it right the first time? Why do their instincts seem so bad nowadays? It's gotten to the point that players now recognize the pattern as of late. It's now a meme that each WoW expansion is only good and in a final state during its last patch. Each patch until then, the developers ignore any feedback and stick to their guns, even doubling down on their decisions in some instances. Then in the last patch, they seemingly wake up from this fog of disillusionment and implement the changes players have been asking for since alpha testing. And at that point, it's too late as interest has worn out. In order to counter that, the WoW developers announce the next expansion and whip everyone into a frenzy speculating about where they will go, if their class will finally get some much needed fixes, and what the raids will be. The cycle begins anew and addicted players get strung along on promises. Finally, after all these missteps, all these confrontations between the community and the development team, a bombshell landed on July 20th. The California Department of Fair Employment and Housing filed a lawsuit against Activision Blizzard. There were two major points to the suit. First, and I believe what they consider to be the major point, is that they found many instances of discrimination and unfair treatment against women and minorities in the workplace. Women were underpaid compared to their male peers, passed over for promotion regularly, and shouldered more of the workload while being micromanaged and treated differently. The second point, and what has gotten more press and has been talked about more because of the lurid details, is the frat boy culture of the company, which includes some sexual harassment allegations. Unfortunately, this is also where World of Warcraft is specifically mentioned, and two people by name. Alex Afrasabi, a senior creative director who was quietly let go last year, right in the midst of the investigation, and J. Allen Brack, the president of Blizzard, who apparently knew at least somewhat of what was transpiring and did little more than a couple verbal warnings about it. Now I will say, I believe today's culture is too quick to judge, and unfortunately too often are the accused deemed to be guilty before they have a fair trial. The public wants to quickly digest the scandal, be outraged, point the finger, and move on. Even if someone is wrongly accused and is later found to be innocent, the damage has already been done. Their acquittal is minor news, and all anyone remembers about them is the allegations that initiated the story. It's akin to newspapers that print headlines that convict someone without much evidence. Then months later, when they are found to have been too hasty and wrong, the retraction is buried at the bottom of page 23. However, bolded and italicized, however, in this case, it isn't a he said, she said situation. This is not a suit brought forth by one employee alleging misconduct by one supervisor for one incident. This is a lawsuit followed by a government agency after they conducted a 2-year investigation. Typically, government agencies, and I too find this surprising, don't usually waste taxpayer money by filing frivolous lawsuits. They build up a strong case with solid evidence before they move to file. This lawsuit has opened the floodgates, and every day more former and current Blizzard employees are coming forward to share some of the horror stories of the toxic work environment they've endured. Additionally, more incriminating videos, pictures, and texts are unearthed that seem to support the claims in the lawsuit. So while I still think it's prudent to wait and see what the final outcome is, it is looking pretty damning right now. And how does the out-of-touch company executives react to this? Well, in typical fashion, their first press release does not come off too well. Activision Blizzard said that the department rushed to file an inaccurate complaint rather than have good faith discussions with us to better understand and resolve any claims or concerns before going to litigation. The company further said it was sickened by the agency's complaints of an employee's death by suicide and the insinuation that it was caused by a toxic workplace environment. They chastised the agency and blamed them for companies moving out of the state. If this wasn't bad enough, it was followed up by an internal note to staff written by Fran Townsend, the company's executive vice president and chief compliance officer. In her statement, she basically denied that anything had ever happened at all. To apparently no one's surprise except Activision Blizzard's, this was not well received by the public. I'm glad to see that this will no longer be swept under the rug. I won't go through all the ensuing drama and Twitter posts and petitions as new revelations are coming out daily. However, I will say this. The actions that Activision Blizzard are accused of course, despicable and should not be tolerated by anyone, anywhere. I feel sorry for the honest Blizzard employees who just wanted to go in and perform a dream job but were subjected to a toxic work environment. I'm glad that people are free to come forward now without fear of reprisal, and I hope that Blizzard's HR department is cleaned up so it becomes a haven for helping employees rather than suppressing them to protect the executives. As per usual with Blizzard Communications, they were off base at first, but are now acknowledging that they have some work to do internally and pledging to clean up their act. However, talk is cheap, and I would like to believe this isn't just a PR crisis strategy being enacted while they wait for the story to blow over and the news cycle to turn to something else. It's evident a lot needs to be changed, not just at the company, but the gaming industry in general. A lot of the old guard at Blizzard is already long gone, or recently on the way out, and I hope that the company can turn around and be a fair and professional workplace. I do wonder, though. Mark Morhaime was the CEO of Blizzard. His successor, J. Allen Brack, was the president of Blizzard. And now that he's stepped down and is gone, Jen O'Neill and Mike Ibarra are the co-leaders. I've worked in corporate America for a long time, and I've never heard of a co-leader title at such a level. I hope these diminishing titles aren't a reflection of Activision CEO Bobby Kotick just getting tighter control of Blizzard. But we'll have to wait and see. Then you have Alex Klonsas, apologies if I butchered your last name, a senior game producer on WoW, tweet out that concern over any delays means that the players are part of the problem. Oh no, sorry Alex, I pay $12 a month for your product, but I never got drunk and went to your office to harass the women there. Nor did any of your customer base force Blizzard employees to foster this appalling work environment. I can understand it's probably a stressful time right now in the Blizzard offices, but to offer another tone-deaf response that tries to shift the blame onto the consumers is just another brick in the wall. What Blizzard and WoW are facing right now is a big problem of their own making. Obviously, not everyone there is guilty of it, but the perpetrators, as well as people who saw and let things happen or quash complaints, are the real culprits. You may be upset by what is going on, but you still sell a product that people pay a monthly subscription for, and Blizzard has had more delays than other companies in the face of the pandemic. Maybe a part of it is just due to employees being too busy doing cube crawls or playing Call of Duty? Regardless, it's up to a company to deal with their own issues internally, as they should have done with this years ago. If you need to halt production, then suspend collecting your subscription fee during that time. This is a common and simplistic business practice. If a retail company messed up their own supply chain and couldn't stock their shelves, they shouldn't turn around and blame customers who are upset they can't get what they need. It's not the customer's fault you screwed up and are out of inventory. Instead of lashing outward, turn inwards and find the root cause of the problem and solve it. So, after the extreme drop in writing quality, the agonizing gameplay loops, and the disdain from the developers, this was the last and final straw that broke this camel's back. I no longer feel comfortable supporting this company after what's been revealed about their business practices. I understand it's a personal decision everyone has to make on their own, but for me I couldn't find a reason anymore to roam the lands of Azeroth and beyond. So I've unsubbed from WoW. Would I ever return at some point in the future? Well, it's possible. Two things would absolutely have to happen to even make me consider resubbing to WoW. Firstly, I would need some concrete proof that Activision Blizzard has actually changed their company's work environment. Obviously, I would not rely on the company's own words, but I would need to find out somehow that the perpetrators in this fiasco are gone and the company culture has changed drastically for the better. Actions speak louder than words ever could. Secondly, I would have to see a radical shift in the design philosophy from the WoW developers. The game would have to roll back from being a tottering structure of shaky systems haphazardly built on each other with gameplay design whose only purpose is to waste my time by keeping me logged in performing meaningless chores. Excessive RNG, mandatory chore lists, and complicated systems that are never balanced until they're nerfed to obscurity would need to be gone. The world would need to become much more like RPGs of old, a place to explore, create, and have fun with friends. If both of these things happen, I would consider resuming my journey in Azeroth. But for now, I'm leaving this world behind me. I may take a break from MMORPGs altogether for a while, though I could always return to ESO and have started to check out Final Fantasy XIV. Luckily, I have a wealth of highly regarded single-player games that I've never had the chance to play that I can finally sink my teeth into. Older graphics don't bother me, as long as I can experience grand stories and exciting gameplay. So bring on Chrono Trigger, Knights of the Old Republic, Nier Automata, Morrowind and Oblivion, Pillars of Eternity, Divinity Original Sin 2, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, Bioshock, Fallout, Uncharted, Horizon Zero Dawn, and more. If you have any suggestions, please feel free to share them in the comments. Sorry if this was long-winded, but I was trying to condense a lot of thoughts and opinions into one video. It's an emotional time for WoW players, and I needed to get this off my chest. More importantly, it's an empowering time for the employees of Activision Blizzard who have suffered far too long in an untenable situation. I wish them the best and hope they can get all the rats off the ship and course correct. Until then, farewell.